I'm John Batchelor. It is 1849. Queen Victoria, a trip to Ireland after the catastrophe of what something is called a famine, the Great Famine of Ireland. And what we know in America of it is something happened to the potatoes that made it impossible for the Irish to feed their children and themselves for several years. And those that survived fled to America. That's what we know. But I welcome somebody to tell us the rest of the story, the backstory of those fleeing farmers and peasants and young people who came to New York and then fanned out and are the backbone of the voting public of the United States. I welcome Padraic Scanlon, an associate professor at the University of Toronto Centre for Industrial Relations and Human Resources. His new book is Rot, an Imperial History of the Irish Famine. I begin in 1849 because this is a ghost story. This did not happen, but it was told about Victoria and about a village in County Cork called Skibbereen. Padraic, a wonderful good evening to you. Congratulations. I did not know what I did not know until I read your book. What was the ghost story told of Queen Victoria? Where was Skibbereen in the story? Good evening to you.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. So Victoria did visit. So this was in the midst of the Great Irish Famine, a nearly half-decade long crisis in Ireland caused by the repeated failure of Irish potato crops, leading to initially food insecurity and later to profound starvation conditions across a lot of, although not necessarily all of Ireland. And near the end of the famine, Queen Victoria did in fact visit Ireland, but in folk memory, Queen Victoria is remembered as arriving in Ireland in 1847 rather than she in fact did visit Ireland near the end of the famine in 1849, but in 1847, which was one of the bleakest years of the crisis, there are folk stories about Queen Victoria stepping off of the royal yacht in Ireland and then seeing sort of words appear on a stone, arise ye dead from Skibbereen and come to Cork to welcome your queen. So Skibbereen was a village, and Cork is a village. I mean, it's still a settlement in Cork in Ireland, in the south of Ireland. That was the site of one of the kind of most dramatic and most highly publicized moments in the famine, when a journalist visited Skibbereen in 1847 and saw this scene of sort of unbelievable, like bleak depravity of bodies lying in the streets and a woman who had just given birth, kind of just still covered in blood, just a scene of complete kind of social collapse. And so Skibbereen became this icon of the Irish famine. And in folk memory, right, it's this moment when Queen Victoria steps off her boat and is suddenly confronted by the ghosts of the Irish famine. And so it's, I think a good place to start thinking about and talking about the history of the famine.
How we got to here. Cummins was the man, the journalist. And at one point, he reports a young woman crawled out of a house where she'd been living or existing as she starved to death with her mother and father and relatives who she was too weak to move. So she watched them being infested by the rats and the insects for days before someone came in. Cummins came in and she crawled out and begged him for help. And that woman who gave birth, she grabbed at Cummins and he fled.
That's right.
He came back with police the next day and they found bodies everywhere. They starved to death in their houses. Well, you can call them a house, what was left of them. How did we get to this? And it begins with an understanding of Irish agriculture here in the 19th century. 19th century. This is the British Empire. This isn't ancient history. It's potato, yes, but Padraic introduces us to the three legs of the stool that was, in good years, sustaining those people in Skibbereen and everyone else. The three legs of the stool: the
Sure.
potato, the pig, and the ecosystem itself, the turf. How did it work, Padraic?
Right. So I think it's worth, I think, understanding briefly just the role that potatoes played in Irish agriculture, because the potato was a kind of glue that held together a system that was fairly productive, right? I mean, from 1801, Ireland was no longer, in the 18th century, Ireland was a kind of subordinate sister kingdom to Great Britain. But from 1801, Ireland was a part of the United Kingdom. And so Ireland was not just a part of the British Empire, but part of the British state itself, with representation in Parliament, with representation in the Lords, with the same currency, without trade barriers between the islands. And Ireland provided a really substantial portion of the imported food, especially beef and pork and oats. That British consumers were able to buy, right? So Ireland was a an agricultural exporting economy. But Ireland was also one of the places in the British Empire with the lowest agricultural wages for laborers, right? It was an extraordinarily capital poor um, island, and it was also a place where a lot of people lived on very little money. And into the breach stepped the potato, right? The potato, this crop that had first crossed the Atlantic in the wake of the Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors of the 16th century, right? It's an American crop that was imported from the Americas back to Europe, and across Western Europe became this backstop that many poor farmers and agricultural workers across Western Europe relied on in times of crisis, in times when other crops failed, in times of war. Right, there were a lot of peasants in Germany who survived the 30 Years' War in part because they were able to hide potatoes in the ground when marauding armies crossed, Catholic and Protestant armies crossed Germany. In Ireland, though, this backstop crop became the first the staple and then a kind of hyper staple for Irish agricultural laborers for reasons that we can explore maybe in a few minutes. But on the eve of the famine, right, the potato, in concert with the pig and, as you say, with peat moss, with turf, flammable, virtually free fuel. That still carpets a lot of the Irish countryside. A lot of Ireland is still bog. Um, Formed this very fragile, but in good years, fairly I don't want to say robust, having just said it's fragile, but this kind of in good years, these kind of three elements together could keep people alive. So the potato's value was that it was could produce enormous yields, right? So potatoes even now are grown not from seeds. Usually, they're grown from cuttings. So if you want to grow a potato yourself, right, you can take a potato, cut out the eyes into sizable chunks, and then bury the chunks of the tuber. And provided those seed cuttings are not eaten by pests or killed by a pathogen, you can get a fairly large yield of potatoes very quickly. And in the 18th century and the early 19th century, those yields were even bigger. And so potatoes were inexpensive and produced really huge quantities of food on relatively small parcels of land with relatively little um, uh, I mean, comparatively speaking, with relatively little maintenance. So for Irish laborers who are earning very low wages for taking care of flocks or for caring for cattle or for growing oats, they became a way of um, paying low for they became a means through which landlords could pay very low wages while simultaneously not worrying about their workforce starving to death. And so the potato and its abundance became a kind of glue that held together Irish rural society, and especially the rural society farm laborers, so the kind of poor, the very poor and the landless within Irish society. And it's worth noting, right? Ireland is the only place in Western Europe now that has fewer people in 2026 than it had in 1846 or 1845, right? Ireland is substantially a less populated country than it was in that era. So on the eve of the Irish famine, there were about 9 million people, just under 9 million people living in Ireland. And about 2 million of those people survived exclusively on potatoes.
Let,
Um,
let, let us discuss how Ireland was divided up by the English crown. It's not a natural emergence of governance. It's the colonial masters, it's the conquerors who developed Ireland into the poor rural basis of the famine. I come to how did Ireland come to be cut up and owned by the English? Where did this come from? Well, it
right.
starts with James the First and his son Charles the First, who has his head cut off by Parliament, and Oliver Cromwell, the great protector, who leads an army into Ireland and massacres and storms and seizes and conquers. And then, in reward for helping Cromwell cut up Ireland and persecute the Catholics, he hands out land to men who fought with him. And Patrick offers one example that helps. What was Shirley Castle? Where did that come from? What did it look like? What was its place in the economy?
Sure. I mean, Shirley Castle is Shirley Castle. I mean, it's so Shirley Castle is a castle in Monaghan, in Ireland. I think it still stands. I think it's a hotel now, if you want to visit, with a golf course attached. But it's in Monaghan in southern Ulster, and the Shirley family, who owned the castle and owned the land surrounding it. On the eve of the famine, owned about a tenth of the whole county of Monaghan. And they were the descendants of Walter Devereux, the first Earl of Essex, who had been deeded the land even before Cromwell, in fact, right? Who had been given the land during the reign of Elizabeth I as a reward for his participation in the early campaigns to install a new English-led or Anglicizing colony in what's now the north of Ireland, right? In what's now still part of the United Kingdom, the Ulster Plantation. And so the Shirleys owned this land, and they, on the eve of the famine, they were by the standards of Irish landlordism, they were not particularly neither good nor bad, really. They were, which means they were probably not like they weren't notorious landlords, but they weren't at the same time landlords who were considered to be particularly friendly to their tenants. And Shirley Castle was a building that the Shirleys had put up. I forget exactly when they broke ground, in the early 19th century, I think, that was designed to kind of evoke an ancient Irish past, right? It was this faux Tudor castle. It was decorated with artifacts of the family history inside. They had some Spanish great masters hanging on the walls. It was this sort of very deliberately anachronistic looking building. And that was really one of the features of the Irish landscape, right? It was this landscape that looked ancient, right? It was still farmed principally by a large number of tenant farmers and sometimes landless farmers and laborers who were mostly growing potatoes, which they were either eating themselves or feeding to pigs that they then would sell once a year to make rent. And they were burning turf, right? This was a very low technology, low capital, low wage economy. And it looked old, right? It looked ancient. And Shirley Castle evoked that. It was meant to look like something from the 16th century. But one of the things I think that's important to understand about the history of the Irish famine, and one of the themes that I emphasize in Rot, is that those appearances can be deceiving, right? The Irish countryside looked old, but in fact, Ireland was quite closely connected to global markets. It was quite closely connected to British markets, and the Shirleys were not kind of old-fashioned medieval landlords. They were quite sophisticated, very modern merchants, right? They sold agricultural products, they collected rent, they employed a staff of professional managers and land agents to collect rent on their behalf. And so I take in the book Shirley Castle as an emblem both of the kind of anachronistic aesthetics of Ireland, but also its very real economic modernity in the early 19th century. And that disjuncture is really important to the book, and I think it's really important to understanding the famine.
The Victorian era. Here's the facts of who owned the land in the Victorian era. About 4,000 people owned 80% of Ireland. 2,000 owned 93% of Scotland. 5,000 owned more than half of England. 60% owned Wales. 60% of Wales was owned by a few thousand people. So
Yeah.
what we had was a forced enslavement of the people who lived on the land. They had no choice. And Patrick, we're going to spend some time talking about corn acres and subletters and dividing the land up because that is the backstory for the famine. And the famine is the backstory for the Irish migrants of the late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah.
I wanted to emphasize that nobody in Ireland voted for 4,000 people to own all that land. Nobody invited Devereux and the Shirleys into County Cork or their county that they came in. They were there by conquest. Do I say that correctly, Professor?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, right? I mean, I think it's also hard to say. I mean, like it's worth noting, right, that the United Kingdom. I mean, this is the United Kingdom in the first half of the 19th century had a larger electorate than it had in the 18th century. But to call the United Kingdom a democracy would miss, some important realities about how the country was governed, right? It's an oligarch in many ways. The UK is an oligarchy dominated by aristocrats whose wealth flows from land, and a small but in the 19th century growing group of industrialists and merchants whose income comes from buying, making, and selling things. And
Let's go
and
right
yet,
to the famine, Professor. We'll go right to it
yeah,
as you explicate. The observation that people were starving did not come in just between 45 and 50, 1845 and 50. There had been failures of crops many times in the early part of the 19th century, and that's the important area we're looking at, the 19th century. After the Union Act brought members of Parliament and members of the House of Lords in from Ireland, and so theoretically they were participating in their own governance. There's a quote in Padraic's book that helps understand the Victorian opinion of the poor farmers of Ireland who struggled on land that was taken from Ireland a century, 2 centuries before, after Elizabeth's time, after James I's time, after Charles I's time, during the time of Cromwell, the Lord Protector, and then the Restoration. The English kept the land. They didn't ask the Irish permission. And Thomas Robert Malthus, who's an economist of the Victorian era, he explained the famine and what was going on when the Irish were starving. They were starving often. They were always at the edge of starvation. Even the well-to-do peasant had to watch his crop and balance off, do I sell the pigs? Do I sell the cow? Do I sell the potatoes? What will the price be? You had to do arbitrage all the time. Malthus argues, I'm reading from Patrick's book, a civilized and well-governed society would not choose to feed the poor, since without the check of hunger, the poor would not work, but would reproduce, making a subsistence crisis inevitable. Nature in such a crisis would restore the balance between population and food supply through, quote, famine, the last, the most dreadful resource of nature. That is the opinion of a Victorian economist. And I believe, Patrick, it's fair to say that that was uniformly practiced. The idea if they're not going to starve, they won't work for us. Is that correct?
yeah. I mean, I think it's important to, yeah. I mean, I think the association between and the preoccupation with work ethic and with steady work is something that exercised a lot of Victorian policymakers and political economists, or I mean, they would, as they would have called themselves at the time, right? And so one of the big questions for the British Empire, especially in relationship to the many peoples outside of Britain proper, and indeed quite a lot of people in Britain who were considered to be insufficiently civilized to maintain the kind of work ethic of the Victorian middle class, right? The question was, how do you get people to work, right? And that was a question that animated British policy at the abolition of slavery in the British Caribbean in 1833, right? The first question for British policymakers after abolition was how to get formerly enslaved laborers to continue to work on sugar plantations, despite the long associate, despite the very low wages that were going to be offered on sugar plantations, and also the centuries long association between sugar plantations and mass enslavement. So that was a question for the abolitionists. In British cities, the question was how can the urban poor be not not compelled to work, right? And that's I think that that's one of the kind of fault lines in Victorian thinking about labor and Victorian thinking about this really amorphous concept of civilization is how can you get people to want freely to choose to work for low wages for long hours and save their money in a way that is consistent with the expectations of the Victorian middle class, right? And for people like Malthus, um, Malthus was interested in population above all, right? We still think about Malthus in terms of what, if you in a sociology class or a demography class, what they call a Malthusian crisis, right? Malthus hypothesized in his book, Essay on the Principle of Population, that food production would inevitably be outstripped by population growth because population growth grows exponentially, whereas food production at best grows geometrically. And so at some point, right, those two curves, that kind of straight line of gradually increasing food production and that really rapidly increasing line of population growth, eventually the one would cross the other, and then you would have some sort of crisis. And so for Malthus, I mean, I think Malthus didn't welcome starvation. And I mean, he was sort of indifferent to it, but he didn't welcome it as much as he judged it to be inevitable, right? And so the consequences of providing people who are incapable, in his view, of limiting population on their own would then be subject to the much heavier, much more brutal forces of nature. So that's what Malthus means when he says that famine is the last most dreadful resource of nature. So Malthus was interested in examining what made populations around the world um, increase dramatically and what made them remain static. And for him, the object of government was not to provide anything to the poor who might then um, take those gifts, I guess, or those resources from the state and use them imprudently to increase their numbers, but rather to figure out what sorts of social policies work naturally. And the idea of what is natural and what isn't natural is really important to the Victorians. What conditions could be created such that people would voluntarily restrict population growth? And so for Malthus, right, in Ireland, Malthus hypothesized, and he wrote very little about Ireland, which is interesting, considering that Ireland was, um, like the growing population of Ireland was a real obsession for early 19th century Britons. Um, but Malthus wrote a couple, I think a single, in the end, unsigned essay that I quote in the book. And Malthus imagined that Ireland's population would reach 20 million people by the end of the 19th century. And for him, the problem, one of the reasons why that was possible, and one of the kind of profound hazards of that fact was that the potato was just too generous in Malthus's view. It was too easy to grow, and it provided too much food with too little input of labor. And consequently, it was a means through which the Irish poor could reproduce without any of the kinds of disciplinary and ostensibly civilizational checks on their population that operated in other societies. So Malthus is a rich brew, right? He's thinking about food supplies. He's thinking about population growth. He's also thinking about the kinds of stimuli that change or don't change the behavior of people who the British Empire would judge to be less civilized than middle class Britons. So there's an awful lot going on in Malthusian thought, and it's telling, right? Because Malthus was among the most influential political economists of the first half of the 19th century in Britain.
This is an island of landlords. We've talked about the Shirley Castle, the Fall Castle, but the landlords would use jobbers, debt collectors, to work for them, and they would rent out pieces of land for rent. And if you didn't make your rent, you were either evicted or in some way you had your livestock confiscated. We need to do some definitions here, Padraic. What is a conacre? What did it mean?
Yeah, Conacher is a kind of leasehold that was very common in Ireland, and I think still exists in some parts of Ireland, although it's now very, obviously been modified a lot over time. It's a kind of lease that is renewed every year, and it doesn't span a full 12 months. So it's usually 10 or 11 months, depending on the region. It's priced relatively high. I mean, it's not priced very high for the standards of rents of land in England, for example, but for Ireland, it's quite expensive. And it's very small. So it's land rented for a quarter acre to an acre of land rented for 10 or 11 months. On an annual basis. It usually is rented pre-manured and it's designed for growing potatoes.
And soil only, right, Professor? Soil only.
That's right. And in I mean all Irish land is rented what's called soil in this area what's called soil only, which means that the land that any improvements that a tenant makes to the land can then be folded into their rent the next time they renew. So in England, right, where generally people who are known as farmers in this era, right, farmers in England, when you hear farmer in 19th century England, don't think necessarily poor agricultural labor. Think somebody with a fair amount of money who's renting a pretty large chunk of land, and often is engaged in some kind of partnership with a much wealthier aristocratic landlord to improve the land in some way through irrigation or through road building or canal building. And in that case, right, if a tenant farmer in England invests £5,000 in building a canal, making it easier to bring their food, the food they produce on their farm to market, then that cost is shared with the landlord, or the landlord makes a cut in rent, or they have some kind of business relationship to each other that makes it such that the rent doesn't go up because the tenant has improved the land. But in Ireland, where land is rented soil only, if a tenant improves the land, then the next year the rent could go up. But Conacher is rented soil only, but Conacher land was very rarely improved in any way. It was very small parcels of land rented to relatively and sometimes very poor people in order to grow potatoes and survive from year to year, wages notwithstanding.
And you have one anecdote where a man won't even whitewash his own house because he'd think that the jobber, the debt collector, would see it from the road and charge him more, say, I'm not charging him enough.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's a tenant tells a visitor walking through rural Ireland sees this is talking to a cottager, and the cottager says, like is being asked like, why don't you paint your cottage? It's falling into disrepair. It's gone to seed. And he replies, right, that the landlord's agent might see
Right.
a prettily whitewashed cottage from his horse and think, hey, this cottage has been undervalued. Let's raise the rent. And so that feature, that feature of the Irish economy is really telling because it shows the way that Ireland is integrated into the economy of the United Kingdom, but it is systematically at a disadvantage. And the kind of forces that are impelling the United Kingdom to greater and greater wealth and productivity and prosperity in the 19th century are at the same time they're pulling Ireland apart. right? So what is the kind of economic vitality that is accelerating in the United Kingdom is having a paradoxical and kind of opposite effect in Ireland and kind of pulling the Irish economy apart at the seams.
You plant on St. Patrick's Day and you harvest in November, perhaps. That's the agricultural calendar. However, the blight comes. It comes from a seed shipment from the Americas back to Europe, and it isn't understood. They're not ignorant of how crops grow. They don't have the language that we use today, but they do see it strike. And when it does strike, it spreads from country to country, and it comes to Ireland in the early 1840s. But they'd had famine scares before and failures of crops. This was different, correct, Professor?
That's right. Yeah. So, yes. So the Irish potato crop. So one of the features of potatoes, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, is that they're usually grown from cuttings rather than from seed. And that means that in good years, they can produce really startling and impressive yields. But it also means that every potato grown from a cutting is a clone of the potato that it was cut from. And that lack of genetic diversity in potato crops makes them especially vulnerable to pests and especially vulnerable to pathogens. And so Ireland and potatoes, are fairly hardy, but they can still be killed in the ground by adverse weather or too much rain or too little rain. And so Ireland depended on potatoes long before the Great Famine began in 1845. And the Irish potato crop failed many times, both before and after Ireland was integrated into the United Kingdom in 1801. But it never failed. Those failures were less complete, and they were also often local. So, for example, poor weather in the southwest of Ireland might harm southwestern Irish potato crops, leading to localized famine or localized subsistence crisis before the Great Famine. But as you say, the Great Famine was caused not by weather or by a sort of epidemic of an already circulating virus or pest or other pathogen of potatoes. It was caused by a novel pathogen, which plant geneticists have now identified or believe that they've identified as originating in the central valleys of Mexico, where potatoes grow wild. And where wild potatoes are in a more kind of secure ecological balance with the pathogen with plant pathogens, and that broke out of central Mexico to South America, probably to Peru, and then it circulated from where potatoes also grow wild and circulated from Peru to North America, where it struck potato crops in Canada and in the United States in 1843, and then eventually crossed the Atlantic. This organism called Phytophthora infestans or P. infestans, which arrived in European potato fields in 1844 and 1845, and caused devastation everywhere it struck, right? This was a novel pathogen that suddenly encountered fields of potatoes that had been separated from this kind of pathogen for a few hundred years, that were being grown in huge monocrops in tightly, in fields that were very close together, which made it very easy for this pathogen, which is what's called a water mold, which is something like a fungus. It's related to, but not literally a fungus. But it reproduces in the same way as fungi do, which is through sporulation. So spores from blighted potatoes could easily pass on the wind to the next field over. Potatoes were really close together. And, this organism swept across everywhere potatoes were grown, and destroyed potato fields everywhere it went. But there were other parts of Europe that depended on potatoes a great deal, places like Belgium, places like the Netherlands, parts of southern Prussia, Poland, but nowhere other than Ireland was dependence on potatoes so profound, and were there so few other options for feeding the very poor and the people who depended on potatoes. So it was really in Ireland where this epidemic of potato disease snowballed into a catastrophe. But everywhere this organism struck, potatoes died.
And it struck not only the potatoes growing on the tubes, but also the potatoes they'd stored for
Right.
their hungry summer. The summer was the hungry time, not the winter time. And
That's
so,
right.
so when they dug their potato pits up, they were rotten. You
That's right.
described the fact that they gave an odor off as if they were rotting human flesh.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know for a fact. I mean, this that might have been something evocative that people. I mean, people describe there being a very distinctive kind of rotting smell from these fields, and as you say, yeah, the P. infestans has this feature which was unique to which was set it apart from other threats to potatoes in that it could strike potatoes in the ground that had been stored, that had already been sort of harvested and stored, as well as potatoes that were still growing. So, in previous potato failures, if there was a failure due to heavy rain, potatoes that had already been harvested were fine, and potatoes in places that were less hard hit by rain were also fine. But in 1845 and 46 and 47 and 48, as P. infestans, these kind of waves of this epidemic struck Irish potatoes, that wasn't the case. And so laborers and farmers who had grown potatoes for subsistence found that not only the potatoes in the ground, but also the potatoes that they had stored for the future had been destroyed, which made the crisis even worse because it meant that there was kind of no buffer, nothing to cushion the calamity of having lost a crop in the ground.
Now we turn to Parliament, because after the Act of Union, Ireland put together with England and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, there were members of Parliament from Ireland, and there were members of the House of Lords from Ireland. And they participated in the debates about what is to be done about the famine. We need now to introduce one of the prime ministers in this period. His name is Robert Peel. Patrick, Professor, what do we need to know about him and the famine?
I mean, Robert Peel is probably the one of the most significant um, political figures of the first half of the 19th century in British politics. He was the leader of the Conservative Party. Eventually was kind of drummed out of office by his own party for his support for free trade, which split. So the Conservative Party in the first half of the 19th century was no was for the most part protectionist. And Peel in sort of opposition to the more free trade oriented Whig party, although they wouldn't necessarily there's less formal party structure now than there was later in the 19th century than there is now. But the roughly speaking, the Tories were protectionist and the Whigs were in favor of free trade, and Peel was a leading Tory, perhaps the leading Tory, certainly one of the most important figures in the party, who was prime minister at the beginning of the famine, and then was removed from office because of a rebellion by his own party in the House of Commons after he passed, with the support of the Whigs, a bill that repealed the Corn Laws, which were the major protectionist piece of legislation that protected the produce from British farms against competition from elsewhere. So in terms of his relationship to the famine, right, Peel, I think was not perhaps as kind of like cold-blooded as he sometimes portrayed in terms of his relationship to Ireland, but he was certainly his approach to alleviating the suffering of the Irish poor was shaped by his faith in free markets and by his faith in free trade. And so when the famine struck, Peel was well aware of the danger. He launched a scientific commission that was sent to Ireland to try to figure out if there was some way of protecting Irish potatoes, and failing that, if there was some way of kind of some set of precautionary steps that farmers could take to inoculate themselves or their farms against the blight. And finding that that was impossible, Peel instituted what became the basic structure of famine relief in Ireland during the famine, which was a combination of public works that were paid for, that were designed to basically be the employer of last resort in the Irish countryside, where farmers or laborers who could not find work for wages from private employers would be able to work on public works projects that were funded through loans advanced by the British government to local Irish relief committees. And Peel was especially interested in importing food that the Irish could then buy at cost using the wages that they earned from public works. And Peel, in particular, wanted to import maize, what was often called at the time Indian corn, or like from the United States. And so Peel secretly had his bankers and his contacts in the banking, and Peel himself was the son of a very, very wealthy factory owner and merchant family from the north of England. He was his father, Robert Peel Sr., was also a member of Parliament and a very, very wealthy man. And Peel kind of secretly used his contacts in the merchant and banking communities to buy a really enormous quantity of maize from the United States, which was then imported to Ireland and sold at cost through the same local relief committees organized in Ireland that were responsible for organizing public works projects. So Peel is a really, really important figure in the early history of the famine, but he's arguably an even more important figure in British politics in the 19th century because his turn to free trade completely redefined the political landscape of the United Kingdom in the 19th century. It made the Tories into the remains of the Conservative Party, reoriented around protectionism. The sort of the more kind of the Liberal Party, which became one of the dominant political parties of the 19th century, formed from the Whigs uniting with the free trading Peelites. He was a really important figure for all kinds of reasons.
Another political figure at this moment, especially ironic given how famous he is for other matters, the man Arthur Wellesley. We know him as the Duke of Wellington, the conqueror of Napoleon and the continent for the English army. However, he was born in Ireland.
Mhm.
He came from one of those Protestant families that was rewarded by the king once upon a time. And now and again, he was prime minister. Did he have an opinion of the famine when it struck?
So, I mean, Peel and Wellington, the Duke of Wellington, formed. They were the kind of backbone of the conservatives. Wellington was not particularly sympathetic to the Irish poor. Um,
You're generous, Patrick.
yeah, he was not particularly sympathetic to the Irish poor. But by the time the famine rolled around, his moment at the center of British politics was sort of long over. Although he was still powerful in the Lords, he was no longer really like, yeah. He believed that it was exaggerated, right, and that it was a kind of it was rumor that the rumors of mass starvation in Ireland were just that. They were rumors that were being spread by the faction in the British Parliament that were called the Repealers, who were members of Parliament, mostly like quite pious Catholics, led by Daniel O'Connell, who were arguing for the end of the Act of Union and the restoration, not the separation of Ireland from the British Empire, but the restoration of an independent Irish Parliament through the repeal of the Act of Union. And I think the Duke of Wellington believed that the famine was a kind of repealer myth, or that it was being exaggerated by the repealers to advance their cause.
Yes, they accused the Irish of poor mouth, right? They
That's
made it
right.
sound worse because they wanted benefactors to arrive on the scene. Wellesley and Peel both followed Malthus's understanding of how to treat the poor. Is that correct? They both understood that famine would drive them to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely a lot of faith. I mean, I think it's there's I don't want to I don't want to look. There's enough evidence, I think, to show the ways that Britain's mindset towards poverty and its mindset towards empire and imperialism and colonialism. There's enough there to condemn the empire without kind of necessarily um, focusing in individuals, right? I think one of the things I try to show in Rot is that, right, there are individuals in the British Empire who were deeply sympathetic to the Irish, and there are individuals who were contemptuous of them, and scornful of them. There were people who were invested in ideas of civilization that were harmful to Ireland. But it was the structure of the empire itself and the structure that had been put in place, as we talked about earlier, by waves of colonization and subdivision of land and institutions like Conacre that made Ireland especially vulnerable to famine. And so, in some ways, I don't want to treat like it's not right to treat the Irish famine as inevitable, right? There were a series of political choices that happened that made famine possible in Ireland, but no single individual in Britain was responsible, or like fully to blame. Like I think it lets the institutions of the British Empire off the hook if you personalize blame, in the history of the famine.
But at this point, there was a reputation the Irish had that is, you think later on, well, all right, this is a rounded story. And that's what Patrick's telling, a rounded story. The opinion in London was that the Irish were violent and lawless, and that if you went there, you better have bodyguards. And if you were collecting rent, it was dangerous. Is that all correct, Patrick?
Yeah, yes, yeah. I mean, Ireland was a really the Irish countryside was pretty volatile. And there was an instrument that was put in place early, under the Act of Union, called the Coercion Acts, which were laws that could be passed by a parliament in London that would then dramatically restrict civil rights in Ireland in order to pass through what was judged by Parliament to be a crisis. And the Coercion
This
Act
is
was
in addition to the laws against the Catholics. This is
well, those had been, laws the laws that restricted Catholic practice and that restricted Catholic landowning were abolished in 1829. So almost 2 decades after, almost 3 decades after the Union. But the Coercion Acts were designed to kind of give, the British state in Ireland, in the figure of the Lord Lieutenant, who was the kind of, chief executive of British power in Ireland,
at Dublin Castle.
at Dublin Castle, kind of they would give the Lord Lieutenant the power to declare certain districts of the country to be under, to like suspend habeas corpus, to permit not summary judgment, but at least like summary, um, like searching of premises and seizing of people. Like they were ways of kind of suspending the usual rules of civil law, because the countryside could be very volatile. And there were a lot of feuds and a lot of violence. The euphemism that was used in the British press was outrages, right? So when they described, when you see, if you're reading a 19th century newspaper and you see outrages in the countryside mentioned, that means, either, an arson, or a murder or an assault on a landlord or a landlord's agent or on another tenant. And that those outrages continued during the famine. They ramped up, especially in the first wave of the famine in 1846, 1847. And as Ireland descended deeper into and towards starvation, they got worse. And so, yeah, there was certainly violence in the countryside, and in the depths of the famine, anytime, when wages were being paid out at the public works, they would be sent out in two identical carts, one that had the money in it and one that was empty, to kind of offer a decoy, right? This was a very, unsettled, and for many people, like very dangerous landscape. And that danger wasn't just to British officials or to wealthier Irish people. It was dangerous for everyone, right? Like especially in the depths of the famine.
You talk about the paying of rent. I wanted to remember. I'm glad you remind me. Ireland didn't have any cash around. Why not? Where did it go?
So Ireland, I mean, generally Britain had very little cash, right? There's just it's interesting too, because there's just relatively little circulating money, in the United Kingdom at this time. A lot of the money that circulates is, if you were going to pay for something in the early 19th century, you would get, if you had money drawn on the Bank of England, you could basically spend it, at its face value. So if you had £5 drawn on the Bank of England on a note, right, you could spend that as though it were £5. But a lot of the money that was circulating in Ireland was drawn on other merchants or on smaller banks or on individuals. So let's say I had, £5 drawn on a merchant in Dublin, and I was in Cork trying to buy a horse, let's say, my £5 wouldn't be worth £5 because that paper that I had would be discounted by the person accepting the money, because they weren't sure whether or not it could actually be redeemed for the value that was printed on it. Right. So there was very little circulating money of any kind in Ireland. A lot of the stuff that was circulating were IOUs and other forms of often individualized debt, um, which wouldn't be necessarily a problem because that's what happened in England as well, and in the early Republic and in the kind of late colonial United States as well, right? These are not places where there's tons of sort of government issued specie or paper being circulated. But in Ireland, that absence of circulating money was treated as evidence of a lack of civilization, in part because one of the key points, or one of the key examples for Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations for the relative developing economic civilization of a country is the degree to which it uses abstract instruments to represent monetary value. So for Smith, right, barter is like the kind of first form of economics where people exchange goods without really a sense of their monetary value. They just exchange it based on their needs. And for Smith, there's a kind of increasing, there's level after level of increasing sophistication and abstraction. So next it's just using gold, and then it's using gold pieces, and then it's using paper money that represents gold, and then it's using debt. And so for Smith, that was represented civilization, and that idea of civilization circulated widely as well. So the absence of circulating money in Ireland was taken as further evidence of a lack of civilization in the Irish countryside.
The poor laws of the British Isles, not only in the 19th century, but I learned stretching back into medieval times. These are important to understand the remedy that was offered the starving people of Ireland after the blight swept them, and especially the Black 47. That's the winter of 46-47. Patrick, what were the poor laws and what were they meant to achieve? Good evening to you again.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So the poor laws were had as you say, a kind of early modern origin. So they were first passed in the era of just of the consolidation of the English Reformation under Elizabeth I. So they're often called the Elizabethan Poor Laws, and they followed from the dissolution in the era of the English Reformation of Catholic monasteries and almshouses, and their replacement with a kind of Anglican parish-based system of relief. And so the Elizabethan Poor Laws are complicated, and probably not going through the intricacies of the laws are probably less interesting to your listeners. But in a kind of thumbnail sketch, the Elizabethan Poor Laws are designed to offer people who live in specific localities relief in times of economic distress in the places where they are registered and recorded as living, right? So there's two elements to the Elizabethan Poor Laws. One is what's called the law of settlement, which is the idea that you can only seek poor relief in the place where you are registered. And the other is relief itself. And generally speaking, the Elizabethan Poor Law was designed to provide people with relief based on the fluctuation in the availability of food and money and in the price of bread. And I'm like, there are historians of the Elizabethan Poor Laws who would like tear their hair out at this characterization because there's a lot that goes on in that history. But briefly, like the idea of the Elizabethan Poor Law is to relieve people who are suffering by either giving them food or money in order at times when unemployment rises or when the price of bread rises so high that most people can't reach it. And so by the end of the 18th century, the basic model was that, that when was to index poor relief to the price of bread. So if people were were unable to afford, if their wages were too low to afford whatever the cost of bread was in a given parish, then the parish would give them money that would kind of top up their wages. And in practice, that had a lot of like pretty serious distorting effects on the English economy, and it pushed down wages for a lot of laborers, right? Because the idea was that the parish rates would fill up, would top people up to whatever the price of subsistence was at any given time. And so in 1834, the British Parliament amended the Poor Law and put in place what was called the Poor Law Amendment Act, which came to be known by most people as the New Poor Law. And the New Poor Law was premised on a different model of poor relief. It was premised on the idea that the only people who could receive relief from local relief officials, from parishes, were people who were willing to submit to the discipline of living in a workhouse. So the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act increased the number of workhouses across Britain and required that anyone who sought poor relief would have to receive their relief as what was called inside relief or indoor relief. So in order to receive food or money or shelter, people would have to submit to workhouse discipline. They would have to effectively incarcerate themselves inside a workhouse in exchange for poor relief. And the Poor Law Amendment Act initially included absolutely no provision for what was called outdoor relief, which was the more familiar Elizabethan model of poor relief, which was to give people food or money or other forms of support in times of economic distress outside of the walls of a workhouse. So that's what was meant by outdoor relief. And the other principle of the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act was what's called the principle of least eligibility, which is to say that conditions within a workhouse had to be worse than the conditions of paid work anywhere outside of the workhouse. The idea being that the workhouse ought to deter people from seeking poor relief rather than encourage them to seek poor relief. And so those two mechanisms were the two kind of core principles of the amended Poor Law. And in fact, the amended Poor Law was seen as being too severe and was quickly watered down a little bit by the English Parliament because to sort of allow outdoor relief under certain circumstances. But in 1838, the Irish Poor Law was passed, and it was a copy of the English Poor Law with the proviso that absolutely no poor relief outdoors could ever be given. So that was the kind of basic principle of poor relief at work in the 1830s in the United Kingdom.
And you can see that not only was ineffective, but it responsible for the mass death that followed the 46-47 winter conditions. There was one other remedy that was offered. In other words, you were meant to starve because that could get you to work. And only in the workhouses would you be fed, but you'd be fed in conditions that were worse than you could find outside where you were starving. This is amazingly over the top blame the victim. But I want to go to one other remedy that sounds benign. What was the soup kitchen?
In the depths of the crisis in Ireland, the initial mechanism for relieving the poor in the Irish famine was premised on the idea that the kind of basic principles of the market could be applied to the Irish countryside to feed the hungry, right? So both the Tory government under Robert Peel and then the Whig government under John Russell followed a kind of two-pronged strategy of importing American maize, what was called Indian corn at the time, which was chosen specifically because it was a crop that would not grow in Ireland and consequently could not interfere with the ostensible normal progress of Irish trade, and would be imported in quantity and then sold at cost to people in Ireland to feed them. And the other prong of the strategy, the famine relief strategy, was to introduce public works programs that would be the kind of employer of last resort in the Irish countryside, where people who were hungry could find work if they could find no other paid work, And the work they found at Public Works would always be set at a rate of wages that was lower than the lowest possible private wage outside of the Public Works. And people would work on the Public Works in order to earn money to buy the imported grain. And as that strategy began to collapse, in part because the price of maize continued to rise, people didn't know how to prepare it or how to eat it, and so it was making a lot of people sick. And more people went to the Public Works, which was never the intention of the Public Works. They were supposed to be an employer of last resort, but by the winter of 1847, there was something like 700,000 people employed on the Public Works, supporting as many as 1.5 million more people with those wages. And that provoked financial crisis in the British government. And the solution was to amend the Irish Poor Law with a Temporary Relief Act of 1847, which temporarily would permit outdoor relief, which we just discussed, at Irish workhouses through the provision of soup kitchens, basically allow local relief committees to give food to people who were hungry, again, often through means testing, right? The idea that only people who could prove that they had no other source of food would be able to access a soup kitchen. But the soup kitchens were designed to kind of feed people as a last resort. And that was a rare instance, actually, in famine relief of something that had been tried on the ground, not by government officials, that was then adopted by the government. So the Society of Friends, the Quakers, had instituted soup kitchens earlier in the winter of 1846, 1847, and then it was rolled out nationally in the early spring and summer of 1847.
But there was nothing compassionate about it. You had a line of 100 people who were given 6 minutes to eat from a bowl of soup and a piece of bread, and then they were out of place by another 100.
So that was the most famous soup kitchen, was founded by a man named Alexis Soyer, who was a kind of celebrity chef of the 1830s. He was the head chef at the Reform Club, which at the time, which still exists as a kind of fancy social club, but at the time was the unofficial political headquarters of the Whig Party. And Soyer set up a model soup kitchen. I mean, he's an interesting guy. He has a kind of combined a sort of passion. I think he was sincere in his desire to help people, but he also was interested in being seen to help people in order to enrich himself. So he had this kind of he was both humanitarian. He had a humanitarian mindset, but he was also interested in making a buck, and who later became quite famous and wealthy, creating and selling mobile catering equipment in the Crimean War, which cleaved to the same principle, right? It saved a lot of British soldiers, many of whom were Irish, from death by food poisoning, but also by allowing the preparation of the more sanitary preparation of food in the field, but at the same time made Soyer a huge amount of money through government contracts to sell this mobile catering equipment to the Royal Navy and the Marines and the Army. And so Soyer set up a model soup kitchen in Dublin, where people were fed his special recipe soup in large groups, and they were given 6 minutes to eat from a bowl in this kind of state of the art system, where the bowls would kind of like rise up out of the table and then be dunked in a bowl of water and then rise up again. So it was a kind of performance for the Dublin bourgeoisie and aristocracy of both famine relief, but also of the kind of wonders of modern chemical and culinary and catering technology. So not every soup kitchen was like that, but I think going to a soup kitchen anywhere in Ireland would have probably been a pretty miserable and humiliating experience, but maybe not quite as dramatically humiliating as it was for people who went to the soup kitchen in Dublin that Soyer ran.
The rules, the laws, all punished people because they were starving, but not starving enough. Some of the people failed to pay their rent to the landlords who didn't much live there, but they had rent collectors. And if you didn't pay, or even if you did, why did they de-roof? What was the thinking, Patrick?
So de-roofing is not just briefly, right? So most people who are poor laborers in Ireland live in cottages that are thatched. and that are rented, right? So these are cottages, the walls of which are built of stone, and then the roof is made of thatch that requires, pretty steady maintenance to continue to be weatherproof and kind of leak resistant. Um, and so it had been a kind of feature of evictions in Ireland that when someone was evicted from their cottage, the bailiffs would pull the roof off, would pull the thatch off the roof in order to make the cottage basically effectively uninhabitable, to sort of evict people, but also guarantee that they not return to their cottage as squatters because the roof had been removed. And in the depths of the famine in Ireland, evictions, which had been a feature of Irish rural economy for a long time. And I think one of the things that I try to argue in Rot is that the Great Famine itself from 1845 to 1851 was the most cataclysmic and the most profound crisis in subsistence crisis or famine crisis in the Irish countryside, but it wasn't the first one. And it had many features in common with previous moments of famine and crisis. And one of those was a spike in evictions. So in the depths of the famine, partly from people being unable to pay their rent, and also sometimes from landlords defaulting on their tenancies, a lot of people were evicted. So in Ireland, right, the land was heavily subdivided. So somebody who rented 100 acres of land as a farmer would then subdivide that land in order to make the rent that they owed to their landlord, who was often an aristocrat, often, as you say, not resident in Ireland at all. And so whether if one of those kind of tenants higher up on the pyramid of landlordism in Ireland got evicted, everyone below them got evicted as well. So if I rented 100 acres of land and I had 100 families living on quarter-acre lots on my land, and I was unable to meet my rent obligations, it was at the discretion of the new tenant whether or not they wanted to continue to honor all of the subleases that sometimes informal subleases that I had made with all of my subtenants. And so every time land changed hands in Ireland, people got evicted, in part because the structure of land tenure in Ireland was pyramidal, and everyone was not everyone, but many people in the Irish countryside were entangled in really complex relationships of landlordism and tenantism with one another. And so in the depths of the famine, right, that process continued and it accelerated. As more people defaulted on their rent, more people had the roofs torn off of their cottages, which was one of the spurs that provoked really rapid and kind of panicked emigration from Ireland. And again, that was something that was familiar, right? Ireland had been a source of immigrants for a very long time. But in the famine and then in the wake of the famine and in the decades afterward, the emigration from the Irish countryside only increased in scale. And it started in a panic in 1847. In 1846, it became more organized and less panicked later, but it didn't stop. And I think unroofing is a kind of very powerful symbol of some of the forces that pushed people from the Irish countryside into emigration.
Yes, the Irish population in total fell 20% by 1851 from 1821. And the rural population, I'm following Patrick's reporting, fell 25%. Is the blight still in Ireland? Do they have memories of it?
So, in some ways, I think the blight is still biologically in Ireland, right? It's still a pest that Irish farmers who grow potatoes need to be mindful of. Although now, I think it's most nightshades have to be sprayed as a matter of routine with antifungals, especially I think it's forget the compound, but with the chemical compounds that inhibit fungal growth. And so in some ways, like the potatoes that you eat at the supermarket now are technological marvels, right? They require really sophisticated antifungal management, and they also require a really complex cold chain. Like if you buy a bag of potatoes do not travel well with outside of a pretty sophisticated shipping and microclimactic conditions that need to be maintained around the potatoes so they don't sprout in the bag. As anyone who's like left a bag of potatoes in their pantry for more than a couple of weeks will have noticed. So yeah, the blight fit biologically is still in Ireland. I think the memories of the Blight are there as well, but I think they're much more prevalent. Like the history of Ireland for the diaspora is much more about the potato famine than the history of Ireland for Irish citizens in the present, right? I think that in for present day Ireland, right, this like sophisticated, wealthy EU member state, right, the famine is less the founding moment of the Irish nation in comparison with, say, the Irish Wars for Independence or the Easter Rising in 1916, or the Irish Civil War that followed Irish independence in the 1920s. Like those are much more formative historical events for contemporary Ireland. But for the diaspora, the famine is absolutely at the center of a lot of people's sense of themselves as Irish, or their sense of themselves as Irish Canadian or Irish American or Irish Australian or Irish hyphen anywhere.
I know my family has married many Irish women in the last 9 generations, Patrick, so we're all a little Irish here in the Americas. Padraic Scanlon. The book is Rot, An Imperial History of the Irish Famine. I'm John Batchelor.